Welcome back to BioFarm 2021. And our next speaker is Mike Harrington, who's an award-winning agronomist from the UK. And Mike has been described as an example of a new type of an agronomist. And he set up an independent agronomy firm called Edifice back based in Oxfordshire in 2005, and he's become the go-to choice for forward-thinking farmers, leading to the low-input revolution. And Mike's advice is based around the core principles of soil and plant health, garnered before the nitrogen boom of the 1920s. And of course, we may be at the end of the nitrogen boom 100 years later, but that remains to be seen. This allows Mike to take really a whole systems approach where chemistry is seen as the last rather than the first resort. Mike.
Thank you very much. Just see if it all works. Well and good. Thank you very much for the invite. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Sadly not in person, but nevertheless, I'm really glad to be here. The phrase regenerative farming sums up perfectly, actually, what we're trying to do. But it's always summed up perfectly what we're trying to do. It's not it shouldn't be something new. It's something that we've been we've moved out of that system into a completely different intensive system. The regeneration and fertility building has a number of components, and the difficulty in many instances that any one of those components, a bit like Liebig's. This is one of the issues that we're trying to get our head around with people moving into perhaps what is a systems approach. One or two components would be flexibility and versatility. That's something that we don't really see. We manage that in an intense system. We tend to ignore that and carry on with our systems. So we have a lot of new thoughts to be created, to understand, to show you some of the good things and some of the bad things, the issues we're finding on farms currently, and to try and help people move towards what is really moving towards an organic system. If we look at I've been trying to add this paragraph for some years, and it is an extraordinary substance. When biology, functioning correctly, soil is a living entity. It's a constantly interacting, interdependent whole, operating a continuous cycle of expansion and contraction, digestion and mineralization. And this soil is actually perfect for direct drilling. The issue is, in many cases, is that we don't have a functioning soil to move into a different system. The picture on the right actually is an organic farm, and I hope to end on a picture of organic farms. Our process is trying to develop biology in a way that it's not hindered by modern methods of cultivations, fungicides, herbicides, excess nitrogen. We're trying to create a system which is more in tune with nature, and I hope to sort of suggest that going forward. Fertility, is a big part of all this. The natural output of the soil, if you like, without intervention, and the culmination of all these processes leads to the production of humus. And the higher the biological activity, the more diverse, more stable, and more resilient this environment and system becomes. Talk to youngsters who have no knowledge about agriculture whatsoever, and we offer them the opportunity to see pictures as a farm. There's absolutely nobody that actually chooses the picture on the right. Fields and soil linked to the picture on the right than we do have on the left. You know, the biological activity in both of these can be limited according to, obviously, the high in magnesium. So technically, actually, it would be more difficult and more likely to become anaerobic and hard if the conditions went the wrong way. So sometimes in the situations you have to help with chalk or calcium naturally flocculates soil. So we actually have a benefit here in just our soil type. So we not only have to work within the requirements of farming, but we also realise that farmers can take soil systems backwards. As you can see here, this is someone who let their land out for a year to grow seed potatoes in Oxfordshire, and for £250 an acre. And I don't think it was enough, to be quite honest. It's going to take a decade or so, even possibly more, to restructure these soils. And of course, on the left, we've had a number of years where we've had torrential rain, and nature can have a negative effect on our soil systems as well. The difficulty with poor biological systems and soils that don't function is that the crops we grow aren't really tuned into these systems. And there's an example on the left here, which has been direct drilled first year into a farm over in Wiltshire in wet conditions, difficult circumstances. And this is a picture after 3 months struggling. We have no root systems. We have no real connection at all. And yet the picture on the right was actually sort of Tim Parton's just doing a film and discussion point about the farm, and we just saw this little wheat plant poking up, and we dug it up, and we've got a nice 10-inch root on it within 10 days. So you can see that the soil has a huge impact on how plants root, establish and connect, and then once these plants are connected, they have a huge impact on how the soil develops itself. When we go onto farm, if we take the best and the worst soils and we throw them as wide as we possibly can, the argument really is when we come to the farm is, well, whereabouts are you between the best and the worst of these soils? And I have to stop calling the soils down in the bottom right bad, because they are literally just in a different successional state. They're not tuned, if you like, to growing our crops that we want to grow. They're more tuned to growing weeds and having issues. It's just that our farming techniques have taken these soils backwards. And so by the understanding of where you are within the system, we can start to ask, is your system moving backwards or forwards? What is it can we do to change that system in terms of actually trying to create a system which is moving more towards the top left? The top left is something that we would like to get towards. It's a system that once we get here, you would like to talk about going organic. You would like to wake up one morning and say, well, I don't have to work these soils. Why don't I buy a direct drill? But that's never the case. Generally, people change on the bottom right simply because they have a system that doesn't work. They have problems and they're looking for a solution. The difficulties are really that this bottom right isn't really conducive to be able to direct drill. But we can create a program which will enable us to move towards a better place. So the bottom left, we've got to think about really aeration, getting rid of water, trying to find an organic manure source, carbon to be able to keep in the surface, to be able to start to build what is a very, very delicate system as a starting point to moving towards something that's better. The top left, you could do anything with. You could plough it, you could cultivate it, you could leave manures on the top, you could put it deep down, you could probably roll it at the wrong time, and it would recover itself. It has a power which can regenerate, if you like, conditions that can look after itself, where the bottom right, I'm afraid, can't. So there's two comments here from a lovely guy called Don Schrafer, who was a cultivation specialist. Tillage is as much as necessary and as little as possible, or for movement of the soil. And this is where really the problems come sometimes in direct drilling, is that people will buy a direct drill, probably use it in a situation which isn't quite appropriate. And of course, the plough is always a tool. If it's going to get you to a better place without the costs and the hassle, wouldn't it be better to do that and restart again? The comment at the top, you should never change your cultivation system to one that's worse than the one you have, is very apt, because quite a few people actually do. What I like to try and explain to people really is that if you have a soil in what I call is a compromised state, it does become very unstable, unpredictable and weak. And if you look at this simple soil food web, is that the energy comes from one source at one time and creates a single point chain reaction, and then it's gone. And so this could be a light rain going through the soil, which potentially could draw air in afterwards, which could create a small bloom. You could have a small amount of debris on the surface in the right conditions. But of course, in these sort of soils, what tends to happen is that when it gets waterlogged in the winter, biology stops. And then you have a small period in the spring where it dries up enough for biology to function and plants to root before you go too dry. But the window of opportunities are always very slow in these systems. And what we're really looking for is something chaotic almost. And the biodynamic people talk about biological chaos. I don't think it is chaos. I think it's probably, it's all going on because everything is connected within a food source. And what this does is create resilience, diversity and stability. And what you're seeing here is multiple point chain reactions, which are through the whole season. And this is really important when you're looking for the soils to connect, because the soils are actually a lot more open. You get much bigger roots, better biomass, better connection to the soil and microbes. Microbes then can give you much better nutrition in terms of connection, and they can promote rooting and all sorts as well. So, we've got the two extremes here, and what we've got to try and figure out really is where are you and how are we going to move the system forwards? I just wanted to put this up simply because nitrogen is expensive at the moment. And of course, if we look at this little cloud at the top here, you can see that we have a huge amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere, not in the available form. But if you look at the soil on the left, which is basically comes from that lovely open structured soil that we were talking about, we have aerobic activity, we had adequate organic matter, and because the soil is porous, air can diffuse into the soil. Microbes can utilize that air, connect with the root systems and digestion of organic matter. And all of this means that they can start to capture free nitrogen and convert it into usable forms for the plant. One of the great things also is that in a good biologically active soil, microbes respire, they breathe out CO2, and that actually can be diffused back out into the atmosphere, where actually, hopefully, we're looking for plants to be able to utilize some of that CO2 as it passes the leaves. So the soil on the left, we're looking at something which we can capture free nitrogen, recycle and hold on to nitrogen, whereas the porous soil that I showed you, it's basically, it's tight, potentially anaerobic. It's very difficult for air to diffuse into that soil whatsoever. And what tends to happen in anaerobic conditions is anaerobes denitrify soil nitrogen to ammonia, and it's released as gases into the atmosphere. And of course, when these microbes respire off CO2, it collects in the soil amongst other organic acids, things like formaldehyde and alcohols, which actually tend to put the soil to sleep or are toxins to poor root systems. So you can begin to see, just by looking at it as a good and a bad soil from a biological point of view, is that one, you can actually work with nature, capturing free nitrogen, and the other one is that we don't have any contribution from nature, free nitrogen, and that's where our intensive systems tend to replace and purchase artificials. The little wrigglies on the good picture were supposed to be earthworms, and there are so many invertebrates that live within a soil and beneficial microbes, but the earthworm is generally the first thing to come into the system once you start working soils. It likes a more stable environment, likes organic matter to be able to work with. But the figures here, if we can have 25 earthworms a cubic foot, we've got roughly 1 million worms, or 30 tonnes of earth casts per year. So our best castings collected to date over an 8-week period is 41 tonnes per hectare. Everything that goes through an earthworm renders fusarium harmless. We have a huge fusarium problem in England in agriculture. It's a second predator, regarded as the second predator. So in a really good biological system, it's outcompeted. And it's a sign that we have real problems. Earthworms, if you get 41 tonnes a hectare on the farms that we're working on, we have a reduction in bulk density of soils. The soils become more open. Those casts have an increase in cation exchange, they increase in structural stability, and they have an increased nutrient availability. They are almost the true alchemists of soil. And those little figures down the bottom about the increased nutrient content aren't necessarily right for the UK, but it's just a point that you get more out once it's been through an earthworm. We do use biology quite a lot, and nutrition, and we found applied at the right time, in the right scenario where you've got soils which do have air in them and they do have porosity, is that we can actually have quite a big impact on establishment growth and health. And what we're trying to do, it is a pretty poor thing to talk about because we're only probably using about 12 different species of microbes, but they are potentially what we call leader groups. So if we're putting compost on, where we're putting thousands of species of microbes, we are talking about a very different system. What we're trying to do is to look at concentrating them into the seed row around the seed. And in many cases now, that means that whatever we put there is multiplied up, and the impact of the food sources and humics and the materials we're putting can have actually a direct effect on the establishment of a compromised soil. And, so up in red here, a response shows a deficiency in something somewhere in the system. And what we'd like to get to in some point is a system that doesn't show responses, and we don't need to do these things. But what we're trying to do is to move the system as forward as quickly as possible, and get this root connection. And you can see down on the on these spring barleys here, the increase in root, tiller numbers, much stronger plants. And on the left here, the winter wheat. The biology is still working at growth stage 37. And we're getting much increased energy within the plant in terms of bricks and higher biomass readings. So as we go along this evening, I'm hoping to show you that this connection becomes more and more important if we want to access nature's pantry, if you like, of nutrition. We tend to brew microbes. One of the issues we have with biology is sometimes they're very difficult to measure. And so we need to keep them as low cost as possible. So for a consortium of phosphorus solubilizers, we could probably do that down to £2 a hectare. The nitrogen fixers, we could come down to about £9 a hectare. So they aren't just nitrogen fixers, they do other things, but because they're difficult to measure, we want to be able to fortify and move this rhizosphere with the biostimulants forward, and often we see actually beneficial reactions. As soon as we go up to 25, 30, 40 pound a hectare, we need some very big responses to be able to justify these materials. So biological farming is about an integrated systems approach. It's not a product-driven system, but products are important to help you move towards a better system. We always need to question, we always need to manage symptoms, but work towards solving causes. And poor fertility is not solved by adding more NPK. In fact, as we've heard earlier tonight or today, we generally are making things worse. I just wanted to get you onto some, looking at some examples really, that pictures that we've taken over the last year or so. And this is a silty clay loam down near Oxfordshire, and that's been left over winter. They're nice soils actually, but you can see that they've consolidated down a little bit by the rains. And if you put a spade into that soil, is that we don't really have very much crumb structure here, although we do have a little bit of something happening here, and we do have some porosity in here. But they are badly compromised, considering that the soil type that they are in. And if you look down onto the soil, we don't actually have many. You've got an earthworm hidden here, here, here. And we do have pock marks for invertebrates, but on the whole, this isn't in a very good state. If we go down to the corner of the field, which has been into a scheme for 6 years now, if we look at the soil in that scenario, you can see what nature can do. We have tremendous crumb and aggregate structure in this area here. We also, in the debris that's falling down here, these little beetles in here, they're a colony of soldier beetles, which have got an environment to be able to breed and colonize. And of course, look at the spider's webs in the larger material sitting up here. And when we look in terms of the amount of lignin that has produced, you can see here the fungal hyphae and the actinomycetes, which are building within this soil to digest. So nature has begun to repair this process. So we're not going to be able to change the main field by putting something out of farming for 6 years. But one of the things that I think we've got to look at is how do we bring nature into the farm? And this is going to become really important, I think, with some of the ecological schemes coming forward, where maybe we're looking at bringing centres of excellence, if you like, for predators to come in around field margins to be able to bring in these beneficial insects. Some of the fields that we look after, they're quite large. They don't have really anything around the headland apart from a hedge, which is cut every year. If we want to move forward and reduce insecticides and also create a system which is in tune with nature, we're going to have to start bringing these areas of excellence, which will allow the production of nature to actually become more satisfactory. We also have to address the issues within the farm itself, and of course that comes down to the farmer and the fact of how open-minded he is with his system. Generally, what sort of happens is if someone's losing money, then that's the first open-mindedness that they will look at. And it's quite difficult to talk to somebody who's actually making a profit in the system to change their farming system unless they have new generations coming in. But it just shows you actually what can happen given the choice. And this is one of our biggest issues in agriculture is giving us enough time to be able to do the repair process. This was just a picture we have on one of my farms, a chalkland farm, and you can see here that the 6 metre margin that was taken out of the scheme, the whole field has been drilled into rape. The rape from the main farm had a struggle to germinate. It didn't have much vigour. It's had flea beetle and cabbage stem flea beetle, but it just shows you, once you build fertility, the impact it has on the growth of plants. So the problem comes back when we talk about flea beetle. Is that the problem, or is it a situation where we have poor fertility which is creating weakness? And I think actually that is the case. We're moving on to some of the cover crops that we've been growing. We have the successes, if you like, are all people that can put their cover crops in early July. Generally, we say if we can put the cover crops in 10 days earlier, we can easily double biomass. And when we take a square metre count and we do a fresh weight, dry matter and tissue analysis, we can actually start to work out the potential of the nutrients that are held within the top growth of that cover crop. And you can see here the sort of levels of nutrients we have. So in this particular crop, which was actually after rye grown for an AD plant, so rye would have stripped the soil out of as much nutrient as we would have expected. Perhaps we wouldn't have expected 230 kilograms of nitrogen to be taken up by the plant in 10 weeks. The one nutrient we're always picking high levels up on successful cover crops is the amount of potassium we can hold. Tim Parton has had quite a number of successful cover crops for some years now. His indexes from potassium have gone from 1 up to 4s and 5s. So what we are doing really is that we're creating a plant which is able to access incredibly deep and have a very intimate relationship with the soil. And you can see here, this is the oil radish poking its way down through, and around it we've got these fine horizontal feeder roots, and already we've got a huge connection within the soil. We're never going to use this 228 kilos of nitrogen. At best, if you could cycle relatively quickly, you might achieve 50% of it. One of the problems we've had with the cover crops is that if you have a biological system that doesn't function very well, when you put a lot of lignin back into the soil, it might take 4 or 5 months for that to recycle. So it's not necessarily going to be recycled into the crop you're putting in, but over time that will get better and you should be able to utilise all that's there. The other big thing that comes to me really is that these chalkland soils that were always having a struggle to get enough potassium into wheat at flagleaf, and yet we have more than enough nutrients here to grow an 11-ton crop of wheat without any inputs whatsoever. And this is an area of interest to us, is how can we move forward now to reduce the inputs of crops going in. But the opposite comes along when you your harvest is late, you're coming in and drilling into well into August or possibly September, you don't get that connection. This is an oil radish really, which has run out of nitrogen, and you can see that we don't have a biomass, we don't have a connection, and actually the blackgrass here is creating its own part of the story. These are not functioning. It's better to have something, but is the cover crop any better than the blackgrass in this scenario? And this is one of our real problems on a lot of farms. This particular year is that harvest was late, and we're not managing to get these cover crops into the system early enough to be able to get them good biomass. So what we notice on poor soils is that the cover crop germinates slowly, it has poor vigour, and it stops growing quicker to the winter. The better your soils become, the later you can drill, the quicker the plants germinate and the more vigorous they are. So that the system promotes itself once you manage to persevere. How we get into growing earlier cover crops is a bit of a conundrum. So, you know, if we looked at a chameleon system or something, I think we've probably, some of our farms have got to look at putting companion or relay crops in, or possibly something like this. You would leave through the winter and you would allow it to grow through Jan, Feb, March, April, and maybe direct drill a late crop into that, maybe maize or linseed or something, and try and get that growth at the other end of the season. We all talk about diversity. It is incredibly important, but not necessarily so in the beginning, because we don't have diversity. If you look back at the poorer looking soils biologically, we have to do as much as we can to get a soils to function. And so therefore, quite often on the very heavy soils, we've got to look at oil radish, and maybe we have to look at Phacelia, but we've also got to look at aeration and drainage, and maybe putting some compost or organic manures in to try and give that, that soil a bit of impetus to change. And we just need a bit of help to get something on its way. Once it starts, you find actually you can begin to look at changing things quite radically. The best way for crop destruct, well, you have to work that out for yourself in many respects, but obviously glyphosate is one of the things that is the most popular at the moment. But we are looking very hard at crimpers. This one on the bottom right is being made by Trevor Tappin. It's an independent of the full roller, so each meter section can tilt. And on this particular one, you're able to alter the pressure. In many cases, we don't want to put enough pressure on to break the cover crop, but we do want enough pressure to crimp it properly. Whether this is a step forward, I don't know, but what it gives you is this versatility and flexibility. Tim Parton before used to have to wait to a -5, which was maybe once if he was lucky in a year, and go out at 4 in the morning with a flat roller, and that frost would literally just crush the crops. They would just burst like grass. Some of the people in France and in UK are looking at simple flail systems, either with or without a drill. And even if we did use glyphosate, this would be a good way to take one lot of glyphosate out of the system. If we're not careful, you can move into using quite a lot of glyphosate multiple times. The cover crops going, or companion crops into rape, I think is another way of looking at growing biomass. The rape, this was rape that went in the end of July, so it was drilled early, first week of August for a lot of people, but we find that that's where actually things like buckwheat can actually fulfill its potential. And putting buckwheat in September, you know, sometimes we get it to grow about 5 or 6 inches before it flowers. And this is a big crop, bigger than we would normally like. And you can see what I like to do between, see the size of these leaves, but between the rows, I like to dig up and just to see how that rooting system, that horizontal feeder root system, is coming between the rows. If we do a biomass on that, and I've included the buckwheat, we've got 121 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in this crop. We have 120 kilos of potassium. So increasingly on the forward crops, we're looking at grazing or topping as a management tool to bring back the management of these over forward crops, to recycle a little bit, to get rid of FOMA, and to basically just bring this excess leaf down into a more manageable role. And you know, it's a possibility that we're actually growing a cover crop within the rape crop, because at the moment all that buckwheat is completely died. So that's again recycling into the system. The other way of looking at broadcasting for the spring, in the autumn establishing white clover. White clover doesn't do much in the autumn, but establish, and that's why we look at beans and bursting clover as nitrogen fixers. They generally die out, and then in the spring, the white clover will begin to take over. And what happens at harvest then is you've got a nice understory to carry on as a cover. These are medium and large leaf white clovers because they've got a fair bit of competition to cope with a big rape crop. So some of the horror stories really is that, when people buy a direct drill for the first time, they want to use it everywhere. This was quite a big field that it's really bad black grass, and so it was left as stubble through the winter. We had a lot of rain on it, and then we went into a very dry period. And you can see that this has been disc drilled into beans, and you can understand perhaps the limitation we have here to establish a bean crop. So if we want a really good crop of beans, a 6 ton a hectare crop of beans, we've got to find somewhere around 200 kilograms of nitrogen. We're not going to get much from this soil. And if we pulled the crop up as it was growing, it had very poor nodulation. So, looking at what we have, we then start to look at, can we use foliar nitrogen to try and get the crop established and through to a point where we can start aerating, lifting, and feeding these soils, which means that we can begin to get a bit of recovery. So this was a farm that's been direct drilling for 9 years, and you can see that actually the soils are still very tight. This was actually quite a dry period this last spring, and if you can see onto the right here, this is the area that spring barley has to root within, and we don't really have a crumb structure at all in this area, and the barley is actually struggling. What's really interesting on these soils is that when it rains, the soils actually look quite good, but when it gets too wet, they hold water, and when they dry out, they go very hard. So there is a portion of the year where things are okay, but the problem I'm finding really is that we haven't got enough organic matter and energy in these soils for them to be able to move forward. And I just wanted to show you this little video of digging these plants up. So you can see that we have got very clumpy roots here. They're not fine feeder roots. They're not penetrating very well. And the barley is actually struggling. If you turn this one up, you can see we have a wormhole here. And that's where all the roots are trying to come through the area of ease of access. And if we go to the next video, next one, it just shows you that these have the look of actually quite a heavy or tight soil. I like to turn clods up when we lift them up, and we want to see really how well the roots are managing to penetrate and come through the system. We're just not getting it through here at all. We do have a little bit of crumb structure here in the odd worm, but look what happens. It doesn't take very much to be able to break that soil up. That's not heavy soil. And so for me, this versatility and flexibility is not on this farm. The idea really that if you direct drill, a system will repair itself is not necessarily the case. It can be in certain circumstances, but in some it isn't, and it isn't in this case. So having maybe one cover crop once every 4 or 5 years is not enough to dynamically change this system to something that's moving forward. The argument is, well, okay, if the farmer's happy with the system as it is, then that's fine. But what you start to notice is we're beginning to get degeneration in terms of weeds coming to the farm. And these are sort of triggers for warning signs to me, really. So we've got here on the left, we've got hogweed, a sign of a tight soil. We have beans here absolutely covered in perennial thistles. You can see in the middle, we've got a hogweed. And one weed here, which is what we regard as a very early successional weed, so it shows that we perhaps have soils which aren't functioning, is ragwort. And on the right here, in between the crop, we've got brome. So the interesting thing about this brome is that it's all been treated with Broadway. And so this is what's recovered during the season. And the worry we have is if we don't react to a system that we keep the same on an annual basis, is that it's starting to degrade into another system, which means that we're going to be coming more and more into herbicide use. And this is something that, being open to discuss problems and changes and being versatile and flexible in how you crop and what you do to your soils is incredibly important. The one good thing about this scenario, though, is that this farm has just coming out of something called an AB15. In England, it's basically a cover crop for 2 years, which you just top, and it's either a legume based or you can put grass into this. So it's a recovery period, if you like, for the system. And you can see after 2 years, we've actually got a little bit of a crumb structure appearing. We've got quite a nice root system. The question is what happens when this comes out and how you manage it, because quite often in a poor biological system is the lignin, when the plant is killed, the lignin ties up nutrients in the soil, and direct drilling into a lot of lignin can be difficult. So a lot of people saying rather than coming into wheat, you probably put that into beans or something. Or if we're going to do this, let's take it out early and put some of the cash crop, some like turnips or something in, which will help you with digestion and recycling. So some years you can find that actually we have way too much root system here to be able to manage. And in this scenario, one might think about doing some cultivations or even ploughing, because it's going to take a lot of effort to put a seed into that and expect it to grow. This was a farm that direct drilled into very tight soil, grass, for 12 months. And when it was sprayed off, it was absolute brick. It is not possible to plough this when it was dry. We have tried to aerate it because it won't direct drill either. So I think what we've got to look at really is that how are we going to change some of the scenarios we've got, and in actual fact grass here wasn't able to change this soil system the better in a short period of time. So we've got 3 or 4 examples here which sort of show we've got different things that we perhaps have to manage. So this was a field down in Hungerford in Berkshire, very heavy soils. I wished I'd taken the picture before they cultivated the surface, but you can see that we really don't have any aggregate structure here at all. They're very tight, high in black grass, spend a lot of time cultivating to try and get a seed bed. We've got the odd old root coming down here. But if we then move to, this is an AB15, which is just coming out, and look at the structure that this 2 years of grass and legumes has done. You can see the long root systems of the clover at the top here, and how easy this soil has responded over a period. It's not perfect, but the fact is that we have a system now which is more in tune potentially with looking towards direct drilling and lower inputs. So grass to me is important, and if we can bring it in and get some sort of scheme to fund it. Cover crops are important, and manures or compost are important. If we could use all 3, I'd love to. It's how we fund these poorer systems with carbon and energy for biology to be able to function is one of our biggest limitations. So this is Tim Parton's grass after 4 years. this has been sprayed off for glyphosate, and they put a cover crop in. These are very light soils, but you can see lots of roots down through here. Okay, not a fantastic crumb structure, but we know that if you can compare this with some of the 2-year grass layers that have been in, that have just been topped, this hasn't got the huge lignin buildup. And we know when we measure the fungal bacterial biomass here that we're able to digest lignin as the season goes on. So we're actually moving some of this lignin, if you like, and digesting and recycling it into the system as the season goes ahead. Of course, building lignin on light soils is really important in organic matter to retain moisture. One of the bigger cover crops we've managed to achieve this year is actually after wheat that's gone for a forage crop. It's been big baled, had quite a bit of ryegrass and blackgrass in it, so that was taken off middle of May. This was drilled actually early July. And you can see here we have 352 kilograms of nitrogen in this top growth and 250 kilos of potassium. This is the first opportunity this farm has had to grow a really big cover crop. Mostly their cover crops going quite late. They're modest, but you suddenly realise when you get a cover crop like this, the potential for reducing nutrition going forward is huge. And this is what we intend to do. So rather than under the RB209 system, where you are basically choosing your yield and nitrogen before your crop goes in, we will be using a modest amount of nitrogen and measuring through the season and feeding the crop accordingly as we need. And the idea really, moreover, would be to use more foliar products. If we can get nitrogens down well under 180 kilograms, we can begin then to stop or reducing using fungicides. That takes the pressure off the biological systems in terms of hindrance. And you can see the interaction with the soils here and the fine fibrous root systems of a big cover crop. We have fantastic connection, and I think that's what it's all about. How do we get this root connection? Robbie talking about the top growth and the root growth being more important. I absolutely agree, but it's the top growth when it extends that funds the root system, and the root system then can connect, and that way the plants can feed the soil. So unfortunately they sort of go together really. So this was the day they direct drilled. So this hadn't been roundups, they just drove through with the John Deere drill. Most of these stems cracked and they broke off, and this is the sign of the wheat coming up some 2 weeks later. It's really exciting when you see things like this, because the potential for moving agriculture forward is huge. It's a question of how do we get these bigger carbon captures, if you like, that can fund soils to move forward dramatically. The last slide here, really, I wanted to come back onto organic farming a little bit, because this was a little organic farm. It's only 250 acres. We couldn't really have a rotation on this. They have no storage, so the farm next door basically farms it for them. And so what we devised here would be to put a grass red clover lane for a season, which might be grazed, might have 1 hay cut off it maybe. Then it was mucked and ploughed, and then spring barley over winter, so then spring barley put in. Following harvest, we would then put a cover crop in, and then the idea would be to come back in. That was ploughed again, and the spring barley put in the following spring. The idea was the third year it should go back into grass for building and muck again. But this is actually the third cereal we've had here, so it was back into a cover crop. And this is a third year of spring barley. And you can see it's nice and clean, maybe a bit shy of nitrogen. And if we could change things, we'd like a chameleon. We'd like to interrow hoe clovers. We found that the clovers came through the grass the first year very well. Second year, hardly anything. Third year, we completely lost it. So, we could enhance the autumn cover crops by planting something within the growing cover crop, the growing spring barley here. And I think there's lots of things that we could do that could move the system forward. The fact is that it's really clean. It hasn't had any disease. It's a possibility in this concentrated system that we can have a cover crop of the same year we grow a proper crop. So we're having a capturing season and we're having a taking season. And the idea is that we try and balance the two. Try and balance carbon inputs with carbon output. And of course, with many situations with organic farms, is that the one thing they're very good at actually is it's capturing carbon because they're not using lots of nitrogen to burn it off. They have a gentle system of building, which means that the plough possibly doesn't degrade or lose more than you've captured. And I think it's a thing that we're all trying to emulate towards, to move our systems to use less and less to a point where actually we find that we are generally within the organic procedures. So we really want to plan for soil. We want to build organic matter using cover crops, capture, store and make available nitrogen and other elements. We want to minimize purchased nitrogen using legumes, biological nitrogen fixers potentially, carbon cycling. Maximize nitrogen efficiency, always add a carbon collating material if you have liquid nitrogen. Consider foliar applications, always feed, always evaluate the need and consider balance. And most importantly, really, we have to try and understand what the plants and soils needs are. So it's about measurement and evaluation on a regular basis. And wherever we are building biology and managing soil, the farmer's income, the yield and the quality are better with lower inputs. I think that's something we see everywhere. And the balance really is trying to understand how the soil works, how it links into the system of growing crops, and to take it all into account. So possibly rather than looking at regenerative farming, we are actually talking about intelligent farming. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mike. So the evening is pushing on, so we have time for a couple of questions, maybe one from the floor, maybe one or two possibly from the panel. So, any takers from the floor? Okay, we'll move to the panel. Guys, John.
Mike, that was excellent. Thank you very much. You mentioned when you were speaking there about the importance of open-mindedness at farmer level. That if they're making a profit already, sometimes they don't see the need to make a change towards a more biological system. But I was just intrigued, even looking at your own history. I mean, to what extent do you think we need more open-mindedness among our advisors, agronomists and researchers? And do you think that our formal education systems are actually producing those types of professionals?
No, it's a constant problem. I suppose really I'm a peculiar person in the sense that I've come from the chemical world in a way, and it makes sense to me that what we were doing was degenerative. And it was my first trip to Acres which opened my eyes to the understanding that all the information and modern technology we have wasn't actually changing anything. And yet the 1,100 people at Acres have all been doing regenerative farming for 20, 30 years and astounded me at what they're able to do. I think sometimes is that I get the feeling that all I've learned is all I need to know. I do come across that a little bit. And at the end of perhaps a long career, the interest in being open-minded and looking at different things can be difficult. I do find that we become very insular, and over the years I became a chemical specialist. The issues really was you became more and more specialised within your approach. So you had a chemical guy, you had a fertiliser guy, you had a seeds guy or a machinery guy. And what happened is everybody went off in their own ways. And I think that's happened with science to some degree, with the chemistry soil is the fact is chemistry has run agriculture for some 50, 60 years without any integration whatsoever with the potential for biology. Since the likes of Dr. Elaine Ingham and all the associated people, specialists on science of biology come in the last 15, 20 years, it's questioning the wisdom we had from chemistry. And now we have a much more balanced approach. We're having paradigms questioning each other. I think Robbie suggested that you can't fight an existing paradigm. You have to create a new one to replace the one that's in charge. And the other thing I found is quite often is that with the scientists, for each one with a new idea, there's 100 scientists waiting to disprove him. And sometimes it's very, very difficult to change a system until you have a generational change.
Great.
Okay, any other input?
Mike, I thought that was really interesting. Can I ask you, you mentioned that compost and stuff like that quite a bit as one of the tools, but in the absence of having large volumes of that, we have huge amounts of slurry in Ireland. Is there a role anywhere in a biological system, do you think, for slurries? Because it will become a problem.
Yeah, I think there is. We use quite a lot of digestate, which I hate. You know, it's very high in salts, and if it's food-based digestate, we can easily kill a rape crop at the wrong time by applying it. But the fact is that it does allow us perhaps to invigorate cover crops. And what we tend to do now, actually, put a humate with it to try and buffer the salts. And we just try and be very careful when we apply it, and we apply it in smaller doses. So I think everything has its pros and cons. You know, even sewage sludge, you know, have things that we don't want to be putting into soil. And I think it's weighing up possibly the benefits over the negative areas of it. And I guess at the end of the day, really, you've got to do something to achieve change. So if you look at the worst soils that we were showing, is that we haven't got nutrition available to plants, even though it's in the soil. So we've got to dynamically do something to change and get plants functioning so you have a connection with soil. And for the crops, really, in the best scenario, we don't need those because we have this connection. We have this huge level of nutrition within the soil that if we can access, we don't need to be applying all these nutrients. So it's a balance. I think it's really trying to understand where your limitations are and what you need to do to move to the next stage. When we start direct drilling, quite often the soils go tighter for the first year or two. So we're getting less mineralisation of nitrogen, less phosphorus solubilization. So what we try to do then is to say, well, rather than ignore it, let's put a starter fertiliser for a year or so. And that way we can balance the things that the soil can't do whilst we're changing the soil conditions. And then let's move to accessing what we have moving forward. So I think this sort of this intelligence and wisdom and questioning is about what is it you need to move your system forward to a better place.
Great. Okay. So I think the clock is against us, Mike, I'm afraid. So we're going to take well, thank you again very much. We're now going to take a 2-minute break, and we'll be back very shortly with Grace Marr for the final session of BioFarm 2021 for Wednesday. Thank you.